breakfast television. If you're even half as sprightly at 6 o'clock in the morning as Susanna Reid appears to be, you're clearly some sort of terrifying psychopath. But had the mornings not been annexed by the box in the corner of the room, the world would have been a much duller place. Not only would we never have heard of Selina Scott, but we would have missed out on one of the most fascinating stations in British television history. It only broadcast for 3.5 hours a day at most, and lasted less than a decade. But its story has more twists, more drama, and even pathos than the entire span of, to pick a random example, Southern television. Not to mention its own successor. It's a story of betrayal, anger, desperation, near bankruptcy, and a puppet rat. It stars some of the biggest names in British television, alongside some of the smallest, and a selection of the most egregious individual arseholes in all of UK broadcasting. It's a storm in an egg cup. It's the 80s writ large. Good morning, Britain.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning, Britain.
The starting pistol for TVAM was fired in 1980, when the IBA, in the last of the franchise rounds to pay anything more than lip service to the idea of meritocracy, awarded the licenses to broadcast from January the 1st, 1982, except for the new one, the ITV breakfast license. That was considered such a startlingly new concept, television, but in the mornings, that it was decided they'd need a little bit more time to prepare. 18 months more time to be precise, with a launch date of June 1983. The TVAM consortium had come out on top of a hard-fought contest. Being a completely new franchise, the last such to be introduced, it was something of a free-for-all, with the likes of Labour peer Lord Lever and already established news company ITN being beaten out by a consortium led by economist and hatman Peter Jay, and also consisting of 5 of the most respected names in British broadcasting at the time. Unfortunately for a lot of them, the protracted gestation period had given the BBC a chance to trump their place in the history books by launching Breakfast Time in January 1983, before TVAM were ready for it. And this caused TVAM to make their very first, and far from last, mistake. They panicked and rushed the launch forward to a mere fortnight later. Even though they were blatantly not ready to broadcast yet, British Telecom hadn't even set up all the connections yet, which resulted in 10 whole minutes of dead air every morning, while technicians up and down the country fiddled around with wires to plug the correct stations in at the correct time. But in broadcasting, as with so much else in the world, common sense is very much an optional extra. And so it was that barely more than a week after the BBC had let Frank Boff off the leash, not literally, he didn't bring his work home with him, ITV viewers and the solitary Channel 4 viewer that existed at this point were treated to Dr. David Frost explicitly commanding them to buy the TV times in the manner of a Sergeant Major.
Good morning, Britain. That's how we'll greet you on ITV and in TV Times, so don't miss this, or you might miss out.
What Frost has said, let no man put asunder. And so, at 6 o'clock in the flaming morning, on the 1st of February 1983, astonished viewers blinked the residue from their eyes to behold a grimy, slightly beige holding slide, followed by a genuinely charming pastoral watercoloured ident, a show-off title sequence accompanied by a strangely haunting piece of electronic pop prog from Jeff Wayne, finally Frost again, saying the inevitable.
Hello, good morning, and welcome to TVAM. New studios, a new news service, and a new national network. And
New
welcome
studios doesn't strike me as the most astonishing claim in the world, to be honest, although it was true. A converted Rover dealership in Camden Town, right by the banks of the Regent's Canal. A new news service, however, genuinely is a bit impressive. ITN have been TVAM's main rival for the franchise, and have been warmly praised by the IBA even as they gave it over to these chances instead. In addition, ITN's main presenter was going to be a certain Anna Ford, who then had to tell them she was part of the TVAM consortium instead. So ITN weren't in love with the idea of collaborating with them, providing their news coverage in the same way they did for all the other ITV franchises. TVAM didn't really mind, however. It was never their intention to hire ITN. Peter Jay's vision for them was of a hardcore news juggernaut, pumping the latest events into Britain's head and brain through a bloody big pipe, and leaving them informed and ready to face the day. It just made sense for them to do their own news gathering, and it could obviously only go really spectacularly well. Seated around the original sofa on launch day were what came to be known as the Famous Five, those aforementioned legends of broadcasting whose faces were depicted in frankly horrifyingly caricatured fashion on that TV Times cover. If you didn't recognise them from that, I don't blame you. The five in question weren't just the on-screen talent, they were shareholders and executive directors. Frost himself was at the helm, of course, at least on screen, and the pips to his Gladys Knight were, in no particular order, Michael Parkinson, the most northern man on earth, then in a transitional phase from the respected and pioneering interviewer of the 70s to the unwatchable curmudgeon he is today. Angela Rippon, with her first regular TV gig in several years after the BBC jettisoned her for setting up TVAM. The already mentioned ITN defectee, Anna Ford, and I hope she'll forgive my lapse into blatantly sexist Neanderthalism, but damn! Finally, there was Robert Key, the highly respected journalist and historian who learnt at the feet of A.J.P. Taylor himself. Key was the odd one out to an extent. Although he had presented Panorama on occasion, he was first and foremost a writer and journalist, here acting as a news anchor. He never looked quite as comfortable as his colleagues in front of the camera, at least not at that time of day. Already elderly when the station launched, he nonetheless managed to live just days shy of another 3 decades. With Peter Jay running them from behind the scenes, sort of TVAM's equivalent of Jeremy Dyson, except Michael Sheen hasn't played him in a movie yet, the 6 of them set out on what Jay called a mission to explain. Unfortunately, the mission was to be accomplished only in the George W. Bush sense of the word, because things started to go wrong within 5 attoseconds of the channel's launch. For a start, the whole tone of the network turned out to be a colossal misjudgment. Hard, heavy and resolutely straight-faced news and discussion, with the odd celebrity interview or cooking slot, were to be the order of the morning.
Too, but we gain in lower inflation, higher standard of living, better economic output. You decide.
Thanks very much, Meryl. Well,
Even the weather was serious as balls, delivered inexplicably by a former naval commander bellowing wind patterns down the lens.
Anyway, in fact, there have been gusts of over 80 miles an hour in parts of southern Scotland and in the New.
Partly this was down to Jay and Frost's highfalutin North London intellectual outlook. It simply didn't occur to them that there were more people in Britain unlike than like themselves. Mostly, though, it's because TVAM fell for a classic bluff on the part of the BBC. When it became clear that the corporation was going to get there first, TVAM made the assumption that their breakfast TV was going to consist of similarly poker-faced news and current affairs, delivered by a man in a suit behind a plain white desk. An assumption based on nothing more than, it's the BBC and that's how they do things. Therefore, the logic went, that's what TVAM should consist of as well. But wouldn't you know it, instead of news night with cornflakes, we got this sort of thing instead.
And don't forget that on each quarter hour, there's our service of local news and traffic information with the latest on the roads. I had an encounter with the M4 this morning. I hope my wife's not up.
What do you mean, an encounter?
Well, there was nobody about, but I hit a patch of ice and I spent 200 yards trying to decide whether the car was going into the central reservation or the ditch.
Oh, heavens.
Hence, I was 10 minutes late.
Is your car all right? I mean, you're obviously all right,
Yes.
thank goodness.
No, and it didn't touch anything, but it was a scary moment.
It's shaky.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, please, you got away from that. Of course, no cars on the road at that time in the morning.
So I'm a fool, really, so do take care.
By the time they realised that they were actually up against the televisual equivalent of a 3-hour sugar coma dream, TVAM were 2 weeks from launch. Too late to change the format, even if J.M. Foster particularly wanted to, which they probably didn't anyway. TVAM was tethered to its mission to explain, a heavy diet of current affairs analysis which opened every morning with Daybreak, scored again by Jeff Wayne. Reasonably impressive CGI there for early 1983. Channel 4s were flashier, true, but they'd only been around for a few months, and besides, they'd had to commission an American company to render theirs properly because the technology didn't exist in Britain. Daybreak here started out as an hour-long main news programme along the lines of the News at 10, fronted by Robert Key, or Angela Rippon when Robert Key felt like a nap. This was, of course, the first show to be produced by TVAM News, and the first news on ITV to come from someone other than ITN. Whoop-de-doo. But this combination of hard facts delivered by a visibly tired and grumpy Time Lord proved to be heavy going of a morning, especially when you could switch to BBC One and be entertained by Frank Boston using sweaters and Selena Scott's eerie resemblance to Princess Diana. Ratings began several thousand places below breakfast time, and dropped, and dropped, and dropped until by week 5 it was being watched by approximately 36 people, most of them drunk. Soon the station was hemorrhaging money like a haemophiliac piggy bank, losing thousands upon thousands every single week. It didn't help that advertising was at a premium, another result of the hurried launch. With 2 new stations being launched as a result of the 1980 franchise round, TVAM and Channel 4, the IBA had to reopen negotiations with the Actors Union Equity for the allocation of performance pay and appearance fees and such like for the adverts that would end up being shown on the 2 stations. When TVAM panicked and moved their launch date to now, said negotiations broke down, leading to little or no advertising on either channel for the first several months. The few adverts there were tended to feature non-actors, like this Walls advert starring their extremely sexy marketing manager, which was the first advert to be shown on TVAM.
Morning, I'm Ian Melrose, I'm from Walls, and I'd like to welcome you to Walls Breakfast Television.
Either that or no visible humans at all, as seen here.
Tube Cube. Clock radio, cassette recorder and breakfast TV all in one. Wake up to what Pi is doing.
History doesn't record what happened to the Pi Tube Cube. All I know is, I want one. And those 2 commercials didn't run together. They were an entire commercial break each. That's all TVAM could scrape together. And it hardly needs saying that this being ITV, advertising is their main source of revenue. But it looks like I said it anyway. As ratings continued to plummet, advertisers actually started turning away from the Good Morning Britain slots, figuring that for the price, more people would see their adverts if they ran them during the IBA's engineering announcements, even though those didn't carry commercials. As ratings steadily approached single figures and the coffers drained to the point that the electricity board served them with a final notice, and that's not a joke, that genuinely happened, the TVAM board kicked Peter Jay in the arse after just 7 weeks on air, and replaced him with Jonathan Aitken MP. This was Phase 2 of his storied history with ITV, Phase 1 being a brief stint as presenter of Calendar on Yorkshire television, and I'm not making that up either. Aitken immediately rang the changes by firing Peter Jay's allies, Angela Rippon and Anna Ford, for having minds of their own. This led to an amusing and famous footnote when Ford and Aitken's paths crossed again at a party sometime later, and Ford took the opportunity to express her dissatisfaction at her treatment by throwing her glass of wine straight into Aitken's stupid Tory face. Let's not be churlish, however. He might be a perjuring, arms-dealing, Tory and latterly UKIP prick, but Peter Jay's position couldn't have been less tenable, and Aitken, and his cousin Timothy, who quickly replaced him as chief executive when Jonathan remembered he was an MP and therefore legally prohibited from running a TV station, did succeed in turning around the fortunes of TV-AM, with the simple sword of lowbrow entertainment and the trusty shield of British middle-class appeal. The most important appointment the Aitkins made turned out to be Greg Dyke, later to become one of the best DGs the BBC ever had, but at this stage plying his trade as a producer for end-of-the-pier network LWT. While there, he created the smash hit 6 O'Clock Show, demonstrating an ability to fill gaps in the broadcast market that no one else could even perceive as existing. Dyke's reign as TV-AM's Director of Programmes and Editor of Good Morning Britain saw the legend of TV-AM really start to come together. His first trick was to replace Rippon and Ford with the noticeably less Newsnight Anne Diamond and Nick Owen, immediately putting TV-AM's tone back from the heavy salted porridge of Peter Jay's vision towards the more Cocoa Pops breakfast time format with which they'd been competing. Just as importantly, Dyke realised that early in the morning kids were likely to be watching, especially during the school holidays. So, with Easter around the corner, Dyke and the legendary Anne Wood devised an extra presenter for Good Morning Britain in the shape of a large puppet rat named Roland. And for the very first time in the channel's history, the ratings started to go up, if only because they had nowhere else to go. By late May, the channel was unrecognisable. Daybreak was abandoned altogether, having long since shrunk from an hour-long show featuring Rippon or Key in a bustling newsroom to 20 minutes worth of Gavin Scott reciting the headlines from inside a chroma keyed box. In came innovations like Wincy Willis, immigrant-hating immigrant Rusty Lee, Jeremy Beadle with an On This Day spot, Mad Lizzie, the eerie exercise lady, and a bit where they read out the bingo numbers from the morning papers. This resolutely unchallenging formula successfully doubled the ratings by the end of the first week to a whole 200,000. But successfully getting healthy ratings were only part of the issue. The company was still seriously strapped for cash. Advertising remained at a premium. Presenters weren't getting paid, and the newsagent down the street stopped delivering the aforementioned morning papers because of a lack of payment. Again, not making that up. Dyke's ingenious solution was to take TV-AM on the road for the summer, hauling their one and only OB truck around various seaside resorts and grabbing a passing Chris Tarrant to present. These summer roadshows turned out to be the most successful programme TV-AM had put out so far, which admittedly wasn't saying much, but ratings passed 1 million for the very first time in TV-AM's history, and kept climbing. To be fair, they were aided by Frank and Selina taking a simultaneous holiday from breakfast time, but at this point it was a triumph for TV-AM just to prove themselves preferable to a blank screen. The news service was still a point of concern, however. Generally they got away with its scrappy shoestring nature simply because no one came to TV-AM expecting an in-depth analysis of world events. It would be like coming to Jeremy Clarkson for sensitivity training. But occasionally something big would happen, something that meant a news-based show couldn't be avoided, something that would inevitably show up TV-AM's news department as the shockingly cheap Tesco value service that it was. The most famous such event came in 1984, when the IRA attacked the entire British government as one with a bomb in the Brighton Grand Hotel, where the Tories were having their annual conference. Instantaneously, the BBC and ITN were there with their cameras pointed at a ruddy great hole they'd left in the building. Inside an hour there were reporters swarming around to capture the carnage and the intense disappointment that Mrs. Thatcher had survived untouched. Of course, TVAM were there too. They had a whole production team deputised to cover the conference. Unfortunately, which is practically TVAM's catchphrase at this point, they couldn't afford to pay for hotel rooms. So when the bomb went off, said production team were all snoozing back at home, mostly in London, with no way of getting into Brighton on time. The local station, TVS, couldn't provide cover due to broadcasting regulations, and ITN, well, they just laughed in TVAM's face. So while BBC Breakfast Time was reporting live in front of dozens of firefighters dousing an inferno right in the heart of where the British government had been sleeping, TVAM on the other side had Nick Owen desperately yelling down a Bakelite telephone at a photograph of John Stapleton, stationed in a phone box. Oh, and a file photo of the hotel from 1956 or so. Meanwhile on BBC One you could watch Norman Tebbit being wheeled out on a stretcher. The IBA were less than impressed, and actively threatened TVAM with the loss of their licence if they didn't start investing in the news department that they used to think was so bloody important. Essentially, however, this turned out to be the last few milk teeth coming in. News coverage aside, by 1984, TVAM were beating the BBC at what had been their own game, having seen Breakfast Time's cosy, lowbrow aesthetic and raised it to a level to which the corporation were reluctant to follow. Good Morning Britain was now the fruit and fibre accompaniment of choice for the British middle classes, and the sun-reading aspirational working class for that matter. The final piece to the puzzle that led to TVAM's eventual world domination came early in that year when the sweaty, rubbery face of Australian media despot Kerry Packer arrived at Egg Cup Towers. Packer was Australia's richest man and most influential media mogul until Rupert Murdoch came along and made him look like a 15-year-old with NHS specs playing Capitalism Plus in his underwear. For reasons of his own, Packer bought a significant share in TVAM, so significant in fact that he was able to appoint his own chief executive. Packer's man was fellow dot-eyed soulless Australian Bruce Gyngell, already a broadcasting legend in his home country as a sort of Australian equivalent of Captain Brownrigg.
Good evening and welcome to television.
Gyngell was the fourth chief executive, later managing director in TVAM's 15-month history, and would turn out to be the last it would ever have. Gyngell's defining trait was an extreme tightness. It was his mission in life to find a way to spend as little as humanly possible, if not less, while still successfully staying afloat as a business and a watchable TV station. His first proclamation was that the budget, then standing at about 18 pence, should be slashed even lower. Greg Dyke's response to this was to take up a new job offer at TVS, and then just about to enter their Tony Montana in Act 3 phase of Hollywood excess. Apart from the loss of Dyke and the Brighton bombing humiliation, Gyngell's first few years in charge were relatively uneventful, with the most earth-shattering events including the departure of Roland Rat to the BBC,
It's Roland Rat, the series.
and the rise of the preternaturally chirpy Lorraine Kelly, who's still there to this day. Another new addition to the Good Morning sofa was the late Mike Morris, a likeable presenter who always felt faintly as if the man from next door but one had wandered into the TV studio by mistake and was just making the best of it. Another innovation in the early days of Gyngell's reign was the Wide Awake Club, TVAM's most successful attempt by far at a weekend kids show. Not that the original regime had forgotten about kids altogether. At launch, TVAM's flagship kids show was Data Run, in which the most Scottish woman in the world and an Apple Mac version of Chock-a-Block held boring interviews with pop stars in a drab studio.
Hello, now listen, I've heard from a little bud that you've got a new instrument called the stick, the Chapman stick. Tell us about it.
It's a 10-stringed instrument, has 5 bass strings and 5 melody strings.
For littler kids, there was Rubber Dub Tub, presented by no less than Dick King-Smith, the great author of such as The Sheep Pig, i.e. Babe, The Queen's Nose, Harry's Mad, and various others, almost all of which involved animals to some extent. His books were so good I can easily forgive him for being apparently the least fun kids show presenter since Bodger and Hitler.
Because that's the stuff, that's what it's all about. That's what came out of those cows.
Whack was much more like it, not only for the kids but for Gingell too. No OB filming, one single set, cheap as discount chips. It was fronted by the alluring Michaela Strachan, and Tommy Boyd as a sort of trying too hard stepfather figure.
The good news keeps coming in. Here's a letter from Bromley in Kent.
Famously, a young Mike Myers also showed up out of nowhere and then promptly disappeared again when he got a real career. But the undisputed star was Mr. Timothy Mallett, and yes, that is his real name. His main duty was to front the spin-off series Whack-A-Day, running on weekdays during the holidays, and with Mallett in charge it tended to come across as the regular wide-awake club with its bum hanging out. With this show, Mallett positioned himself as king of the early mornings for an entire generation of school kids, myself included.
Goldfinger! He's the man with the golden fingernails. Good morning, Wideawakers. It's Gold Fingernail here. Look at this. Solid gold fingernails on my fingers today. Yes, Pinky, what's the matter? Hello?
Mr. Mallett?
What?
Mr. Mallett?
Yes, Pinky, yes, what?
I'm utterly pink.
And I'm utterly gold today, Wideawakers.
Obviously, as an adult, he now comes across as almost unwatchably grating. But then of course he does. He's not performing for you. He's performing for an audience of under 10s. If you actually were the age that Timmy was acting, he was, as he would put it, utterly brilliant. That he made your parents homicidal is just a bonus. He had incredible energy, especially for that time of day, and an enthusiasm that was absolutely genuine and genuinely infectious. Again, much to your parents' annoyance. And I genuinely think I learned more from Whack-A-Day than I did at primary school, particularly about the world in general. The equator, for example, something I never learned about from a teacher, but then no teacher would have gone all the way to Kenya to both do the water going the other way trick and somehow coerce some Maasai villagers to stand on either side of the equator and mime the respective seasons. If you can't respect that, there's something wrong with you. In conclusion, Timmy Mallett, irritating as all hell if you're above the age of 11, but invaluable otherwise. Mind you, even I can't defend Bon Ballerina. It's like your dad down the disco. By 1987, TVAM was somewhere no one in March of 1983 had expected them to be. Still broadcasting. Not only that, but by now they were firmly on top, having thoroughly beaten the BBC at their own game. The corporation threw in the towel altogether in late 1986, conceding the bottom end of the market to the commercial broadcaster and refitting Breakfast Time to be more or less what Peter J and company were expecting from the start. Straight-faced news for yuppies. TVAM had won. But this is TVAM we're talking about. Success and superiority couldn't possibly last for long. Sure enough,
Managements like this spread like a disease amongst industry, not just the broadcasting and entertainment industries, but industries generally.
Industrial action. Have you forgotten how good it tastes? November 1987 was already one of the most depressing periods in history from a trade unionist perspective, but that didn't stop 220 technical staff at TVAM from going on a 24-hour strike in protest at Gingell's continuing austerity measures. Again, a 24-hour strike. The following day they went straight back to work again, point made, and were locked out of the studios. Bruce Gingell had decided that no one who went out on strike would be allowed back to work. even though the strikers constituted practically the entire technical workforce: directors, sound men, camera and lighting operators, and he obviously needed at least 100 of them around to successfully run his TV station. Or so it would seem. But in an act of bloody-mindedness that was beaten only by its astonishing prickmanship, Gyngell somehow managed to run the channel almost single-handedly, while his own staff stood outside the studios yelling that he was an arsehole, for 6 whole months.
And Gordon Honeycomb here in London. Gordon.
I think of myself as a loving, charming and compassionate person.
There were receptionists running the cameras, cafeteria workers dangling from lighting rigs, and Gyngell himself, almost the only person in the building with any sort of television production experience or qualifications, directing the whole mess. For a while, TVAM consisted of hastily shot links to perfunctory news updates, followed by repeats of just about anything they could get their hands on, mostly Flipper or Batman, out of any semblance of sequence and occasionally backwards. Throughout it all, the IBA gawped like a stranded fish as ratings continued to rise. Eventually, Gyngell simply fired all 220 striking workers and replaced them with cheap but qualified, and crucially non-union, foreign labour, which presumably endeared him still further to the Prime Minister. Mrs. Thatcher had already come to see TVAM as her own pet television station, which had always been the intention when it was given the go-ahead in 1980, but was somewhat hard to conceive when they were employing people like Peter Jay, Anna Ford and Greg Dyke. But Bruce Gyngell was the man who made Malcolm Fraser look like Bob Hawke. Plus the Aitkins were still on the board, at least until someone finally twigged that half their shares were actually owned by the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. As Thatcher moved into her own imperial phase, this was now Tory party television in excelsis. Furthermore, as the 90s dawned, TVAM, the channel that was once in debt with their local corner shop, was now the single most successful television station in the world, in terms of financial turnover. Gyngell's white-knuckled grip on the purse strings had yielded profits of £24 million, and on top of that they now had a 70% audience share. To those who still remembered its first months on air, it was astonishing to contemplate. But you can't argue with success. You can argue with a blatant, even criminal disregard for the people who depend for their very livelihoods on your inclination to see them as at least semi-autonomous human beings, but you can't argue with success. But this is TVAM we're talking about. Another brutal twist was bound to be lurking just around the corner. And in this case it was our old friend, the Broadcasting Act 1990. I do hope you got used to hearing about this thing, because it's gonna keep coming up. Inspired by Gyngell's example, Thatcher, who after a decade of near absolute power was basically Pinochet in a dress, deregulated and deunionised ITV across the board. The blind auction franchise round arrived, with all the poise of a cannonball. And TVAM were understandably confident. They were the Prime Minister's favourites. They were just as invulnerable as she was.
We're leaving Downing Street for the last time after 11.5 wonderful years, and we're very happy.
What they didn't consider, because no one did, was that in the blind auction the new companies were already at a disadvantage, because they couldn't just raise money out of nowhere. They already had spending to worry about. And Bruce Gyngell was tighter than a constipated duck's arse. Add it all up and, oh no! Backfire!
Good evening. Mrs. Thatcher has told TVAM she's heartbroken that it will lose its licence to broadcast breakfast television.
Heartbroken she may have been, but it made no difference. For perhaps the first time, she suffered the consequences of her own policies, as TVAM was now on death row. In the wake of the announcement, and because £8 million had been essentially just hurled onto a bonfire for the sake of that dog and pony show, the cost-cutting became even more severe, until not only was it patently visible on screen, it was almost physically painful to be in the presence of. The hapless TVAM news was finally put out of its misery, with the upstart Sky providing the station's news coverage for the last year of its existence. Kids' programmes perhaps suffered the most. Timmy Mallett was relegated to repeats, and the promising whack replacement TV Mayhem, get it, starring a young Chris Evans, was unceremoniously unhappened, replaced by a painfully basic 90-minute and later 2-hour-long slot with the grimly functional name of Cartoon World, and a format consisting of the voice of Kenny Everett introducing episodes of Denver the Last Dinosaur and Maxie's World. God help us. We watched this.
The world! And there's Dink, the little dinosaur. So don't be late next Saturday at 8 for Cartoon World. See you there!
After a final year of slow decay, New Year's Eve saw the lights go out all over Camden. We have not seen them lit again in our lifetime.
We'd like to thank everybody who's been watching TVM. We've enjoyed your company, but from TVM, sadly, we now have to say it finally. Thank you and goodbye.
But maybe TVAM was never really meant for the 90s. Just as the Beatles only lasted 12 months of the 70s, just as the same decade had rejected Thatcher at the outset, the 90s could never brook something like TVAM, something so visibly belonging to the 80s. Everything about it, the gloss and the cutting of corners, served to sum up Thatcher's decade. And that's why, despite it being Thatcher's pet station, despite the presence of Bruce Gingell and Jonathan Aitken, TVAM might just be my favourite TV station of all time. Because everything about it screams, we are Britain in the 1980s. Every contour, every inch of the parabola, every atom of the oxygen in the aerosol and smoke-clogged atmosphere can be found within these walls, beneath this roof, in the shade of these egg cups. We are Thatcher and Tebbit and Roland Rat. We are Greg Dyke, Anna Ford, the Beast of Bolsover and the Jungle God of Henley. We are Nicholas Witchell and Neil Kinnock. We are Andropov, Chinienko, Gorbachev and Reagan. We are the Ayatollah. We are Mitterrand and we are Bob Hawke. We are pastels and mullets and a flock of seagulls. We are the Smiths, Sunita, Duran Duran, and Johnny Hates Jazz. We are the Great Storm, the Herald of Free Enterprise, Black Monday and Hungerford. We are Maradona, Rude Hullet, Bjorn Borg. We are the Neon Heaven and Pastel-Shaded Hell. We are the 80s, wrapped with a ribbon of plastic in bright yellow and served to you in a basket. We are Britain, in leg warmers and spandex and a bright red plastic codpiece. We are everything you need to know about this time and place. We are Britain in the 1980s. Love us.
Oh, I'm glad that's over, I have to say.